Hello everybody. Sorry, I'm going to speak English. My Russian is not as good as it should be.
Воспользоваться переводом, у нас есть наушники, кому нужно, пожалуйста.
So, I would like to start with a question. How many of you this morning used any drugs? Is it criminal? Somebody says. Okay. How many of you smoked or drank coffee this morning? Okay. Is coffee addictive? Is coffee a drug? Is nicotine and cigarettes, is it drugs? Okay, so I think this is exactly where we are. We are confused in the whole process of what we're doing, how we're treating drug policy. I dedicated my whole life to treating people from addictions. I am a psychotherapist, I'm a social psychologist, and I've been working for many years, more than 2 decades, with addicted people. And then I was asked to step in a government position. I was a national drug coordinator of Czech Republic for 8 years. I resigned myself last year, directly accountable to prime ministers. I experienced 5 prime ministers in Czech Republic. Prime minister is the executive role in Czech Republic. President is like a king, let's say. But prime minister is the executive role. So I was very high in the politics. I was also something called deputy chair of the government commission, because the chair was the prime minister himself. We had only male prime ministers last few years. When we had any female. And that confronted my views totally. I realized, after looking at evidence and numbers, that what we have to do in drug policy is not resolving addictions, but harms. So we have different kind of addictions which don't cause such harms, like coffee. I mean, we drink coffee every day. We don't think that we are using drugs. Well, we know, I mean, most of us know. I mean, I don't drink coffee, I drink green tea. But most of us know when we drink caffeine in green tea or coffee, it's addictive, isn't it? We don't care, because it doesn't cause any damages. Now, if we come down to cannabis, latest research of OECD, when they looked at damages of different kind of drugs, including social impact, the first drug was alcohol. Second drug was heroin. Cannabis is, I think, number 10 or 12, 15 or something like that. So we have to differentiate. We know that we have to differentiate. So when we talk about drugs policy and cannabis, let me put it in the context, and then I'll talk more about legislation in Czech Republic, because I was in charge of medical cannabis bill in 2013 in Czech Republic, when we allowed medical use of cannabis, not only importing, but we also allowed production and export. But I'll talk about it a little bit later. I want to put it in the context of the whole issue of drugs policy. As you know, as you know, we have a prohibition system, which is there because of 1961 conventions, but we also know that there were prohibition imposed in different parts of the world before, in the year of in US and North America in the year of 1927, I think. In Central Europe, where I'm from, Czech Republic, at that time Czechoslovakia, under the Third Reich, 1933, Hitler banned hashish, opium, and cocaine. And the numbers, we don't think about it, but the numbers showed an interesting outcome. Yes, opium, raw opium and hashish and cocaine went down. Before the end of the war, alcohol problem drinking doubled. Today, it quadrupled. So it's interconnected. If we look at the numbers, prohibition approach is $100 billion minimum, the estimation, $100 billion a year. 83% of drug-related crimes are simple possessions. People having a small amount in their pockets for use. 83%. So it's so expensive, and it makes no sense. If we look at what are the risks of it and the damages that came out of the policy, not of drugs, but the policy, drug policy, is, of course, we know health risks. In Ukraine, we have a big epidemic of HIV among drug users. The whole Soviet Union area is the whole problem. Hepatitis C, of course, the creation of organized crime and overdosing of people. So at some point in Czech Republic, before we started talking about medical cannabis, we decided to start thinking about it. I'm sorry, this is a map of Czech Republic. Of course, you all know where Czech Republic is, but I just wanted to make sure that you know that we are the heart of Europe. So we said, we don't have money for this. We are in a transition. In the 90s, we said we are in the transition, economic transition from the socialist economic system to new semi-capitalist, let's say. So we said, well, let's start evidence. What evidence tells us? And let's be realistic and affordable. So we can afford this money. I mean, we can, after so many decades of hearing all the ideology, we thought, let's not do anything ideological. War on drugs, zero tolerance, and society, a world free of drugs. Is it possible? Is it realistic? Probably not. So what do? We're probably going to reduce the harms and risks, and that's what we can focus on. So we said we have to define it by money, balance, something between regulations and repression and health and prevention. We have to coordinate it somehow, and at some point we said we also have to integrate policies and put numbers next to each other: alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and drugs. So the whole complex of the numbers and evidence shows us a totally different view. And of course we said our main issue is public health, not so much safety. If we do something that is not pushing the people to criminal corners, I don't know how to say that, then public health is the main issue. So 2010, we did it before, and then we returned to 1998. We had a code of decriminalizing possession of all drugs. Then the Social Democrats came to the power, which is in the Czech Republic, so upside down, because it was Conservative Party who came with the idea to decriminalize. Then Social Democrats reversed it back, and it went all wrong. So all the evidence showed us that it was a very bad idea to come back to criminalizing people, because again the HIV, hepatitis, people in prison, etc., started raising. So 2010 it was again for the Conservative Party who again decriminalized possession for personal use. Of course, it seems very liberal. In my view, it's still very harsh and restrictive. Yes, we say people who are users have very small amount of drugs in their pockets, cannot be prosecuted, but it's still illegal. So here are the numbers. Yes, it's 1.5 grams of methamphetamine. If you have more, you go to prison or you go prosecuted. Heroin, 1.5 grams. Cocaine, 1 gram. Ecstasy, 4 tablets. Cannabis is 10 grams. But of course, if you have less than 10 grams or less than 1.5 grams, you still can get a fine. So it's still illegal, but you cannot be prosecuted unless somebody catches you to sell those drugs, even small amount. Yes, also there are plants, cannabis plants, more than 5. So if you grow in your garden 5 plants, you can get a fine. You will not be prosecuted. But if you have more than 5 plants, you will be prosecuted. We still have 39% people in prison for drug offenses because of large number of cannabis plants. We even have mushrooms because we have a mushroom problem. Well, these are the penalties. Now, then I move to cannabis itself, but just to let you know, in my view, our policy was very useful and successful. We have the lowest traditional heroin market in the whole EU. Yes, we have an issue of methamphetamine because it's locally produced by small producers. But we have no hard organized crime, almost non-existent. We have a Vietnamese community which produces methamphetamine in larger amounts, selling it to Germany, but not in Czech Republic. Relatively low problem of drug use, because we don't count people. I mean, we of course count people of how many people use drugs, but we don't care. We count about, we care about problem drug use, how much the damages come. We have almost non-existent overdose rate. It's about between 20 to 40 people a year in all illegal drugs. If we look at ethanol, alcohol, then it's about 400 to 500. So we have more people dying of overdosing, a simple overdosing of alcohol, than all illegal drugs together. HIV is lower than 1% among injecting drug users. Hepatitis C was, when I started working with drug users in 1991, we started testing all the people. It was around 70% of people injecting drug users were Hep C positive. Now it's about 12%, so it really dropped down. The prisons are not overcrowded, and I think the main thing which we wanted to achieve is to get the hidden population, the young people who use drugs, often young people. Of course, we have 3 generations now, but the young people who are in risk of use, when they start using drugs, we have 75% of these people in contact with low threshold services, because we have our country is 10 million people, and we have about 80 low threshold services covering the whole country, drop-in centers, outreach work. So of course, needle exchange everywhere. So these are the result of the hidden population coming to the services. So in this context, we have cannabis issue. And then 2013, I never wanted to touch medical cannabis issue because I used to say, well, I'm concerned with addictive behavior, with harms caused by heroin, methamphetamine. Okay, some people feel that they have issue with intensive smoking. So this is my concern is. Of course, I was working with alcohol, tobacco, and gambling as well. So, but Ministry of Health at that time was afraid touching this issue, even though I thought, well, I kept saying, well, cannabis is for medical use, it's a medicine, so why should we care about it? At the end, my Prime Minister said, you do it. So it ended up on my table and I had to prepare the first legislation. I, at that point, didn't have a clue that I thought it's in many countries. I didn't realize that we are actually the first country creating a law in the world. I mean, there was some sub-laws in Holland, Portugal, and a few other countries, but concrete legislation we had nowhere to learn from. But it took only 3 months to pass the bill, signed by President. He was a conservative government, conservative Prime Minister, conservative Chair of the Parliament. The Chair of the Parliament said, "No, let's do it. We have to allow people, to have an access. If there is a medicinal use, why not having an access?" Main message that we had at that time, and I still agree with that, is that there is two different questions. One is a medical use, and another one is legalizing cannabis for recreation. Both debates are important, but they should be divided. Of course, using cannabis for any drugs that we know we are using pose risks, much higher risk than cannabis, in addictive power, let's say. But having them for pain relief or any other research reasons and for any other medicinal products use, there's no reason to stop it. The only reason is political, but not scientific. You agree? So we said, okay, let's do it. We did it. What we did, we said we're going to allow research, or we're going to allow production, we're going to allow export, and of course I had to start talking to INCB, the International Narcotic Control Board, which is responsible for the UN control system to inspect countries when they announce such things like legalizing cannabis for medical use. So I had to talk to them, how are we going to do it to be in line with international conventions. So of course we had all these issues. Cannabis is in a Schedule 1 under the international conventions, which I don't know why it's still there, but Schedule 1, for those who don't know, is the schedule of substances which have no use for medical purposes, no use for research. So it's allowed to research, but it's not used. These are substances with the strictest control, a stricter control than heroin. Heroin, medical heroin, diamorphine, you can prescribe, produced with lower regulations than cannabis. Does it make sense? So Schedule 1, we talk about it, but we had to be in line first country, so we had to be in line. So the major obstacle is that any country which says, okay, we'll allow medical cannabis, you will have to have, and that's what we did, you will have to establish government agency which will allow people to, or companies to produce. Production is going to be based on the tender of this government agency. This government agency will also prescribe all the agricultural, handling, and other standards. And if we want to export it to other countries, it has to be, as we call it, G2G, government to government, government agency to government agency. So it's very restricted. So now we're talking about rescheduling, World Health Organization did a regular evaluation of cannabis and said clearly, yes, cannabis has medical potential use for medical use, potential for medical use. So let's reschedule, and in January they said we can vote on CND meeting, which is the main once a year meeting in UN to reschedule. But we didn't because there is some fear. I don't know why, but I mean I know why, but it makes no sense. So we didn't do the voting for rescheduling. So we hope to do it next year. And if you think of new legislation, next year is maybe after next March. It's going to be different to what we have to do it now. Now we have to have a government agency and all production in the country or import has to be through the government agency, and the government agency is the one that is distributing through to pharmacies. Not all countries follow it, but they are not in line with international conventions. I know the international conventions are outdated, they should change, but it's not happening yet. We made a big mistake also because we gave it to FDA people in their hands to be the agency, but they are regulators. So when they have to think about tendering, distributing, exporting, this is not our role. We don't want it because we are regulators. So if you think of new legislation, avoid FDA to be the main, or any regulator to be the main institution. I think it's much better in Israel, where it's a specific department based directly under the Minister of Health, and the guy who is in charge is pharmacist. So they have a different view. Another issue is evidence, of course. We hear loads of people speaking about how cannabis is useful and what are all the diseases, but actually the real medical evidence is not as strong as we could provide, because it takes years, and it was not allowed. Not allowed to use it in a human consumption, so it will still take years. We have some evidence growing. Of course, we know that for pain relief, it's brilliant, but other diseases it's still very preliminary. And I hear companies saying, we have all the evidence now. No, we jump to a conclusion. So it's complicated. But of course the evidence is growing, and at this moment it feels very positive. But of course it's not a savior of all illnesses, as many people would want to see it. As I said, another issue is import and domestic production and export. because it's complicated. Of course, many people see it as a big opportunity for new business, and at some point it will be a big business, especially in Europe. But at this moment, it's very difficult for the companies, and it's going to be for several years, especially in medical production, because it has to be so standardized. Many of you are, as I believe in this audience, from the medical profession, so you know. I don't have to explain. For us, it's always a battle. Do we import or do we produce? The company that has a license in Czech Republic struggles, and they're rather more believers than business people. They have other business, otherwise they would not survive. For medical purposes, it's not easy. I've seen many countries, and since I resigned from my role of National Drug Coordinator, I was invited to many countries. Recently, I was advising to Thai and Lao government. Thailand changed dramatically, and they see it as business opportunity as well as Laos. We saw the same in South Africa. We see it in some European countries, business opportunity. And as such, it's good to put to politicians to have this kind of new growing, in future, big growing industry as a business opportunity. But at this moment, it's not possible to promise that it's going to be fast. It's not possible. Of course, another issue, especially for medical people, what form are we going to use? Is it going to be herbal? So we decided that yes, we will allow herbal and smokable. But I know that medical doctors prefer tablets, sprays, liquids, rather than herbal. It is used in medicine, of course, but it's not favorable. But at this moment, all the research shows that just extracting THC and combining with CBD is probably not going to do the trick. So we're not far enough in the research, but so far the evidence is suggesting that cannabis as a plant with many cannabinoids, as I'm sure my colleague Professor Hanush will talk about afterwards, probably is making the trick rather than extracts. Of course, if we talk about extract of CBD and use CBD, it's another issue. But for the medical use as we see it today, it's probably the herbal form is so far the best, but it's complicated. Of course, another issue is the hemp industry, and now with in European Union the novelty food regulations. So a lot of people who grow hemp, meaning the cannabis plant without the THC, are stuck. I have another presentation if anybody wants me to have give more information about it. I can connect you to my colleagues and give you the presentation. But it's going to happen. 600 products already has been taken out of the market in European Union market. And of course we have the issue of 0.2, 0.3% of THC. We've been talking to European Commission and to European parliamentarians, and you know that we had elections last week, which finished on Sunday, and many of my colleagues, because I was also one of the candidates, but as a support candidate, so my colleagues will take this issue in the European Parliament, and we're talking about some new, at least recommendations of European Union to unify the idea how we work with hemp industry, not to kill it. And of course, another issue is all the myths. How addictive cannabis is, how risky cannabis is. We keep saying, no, well, we should distinguish, we should differentiate between drugs, and there are a few drugs who pose less risk, like cannabis. For some people, surprisingly, what I'm going to say, like cocaine, like MDMA, the biggest troubles because of the money that is attached to the organized crime and the pricing on the black market, and of course the how do I say that, dirtiness of the drugs. And of course, you have people with very good will who are activists promoting cannabis, but not always giving the right impression. And then on the other side, you have more conservative, let's say, medical society, who says, okay, we want to see the evidence before we start using it, etc., etc. Well, I think I will skip this. Let me finish with this sentence, please. Come back to the whole drugs policy. I said we have to distinguish, differentiate, or make the debates about medical use and the recreational use of cannabis as two different debates. I think in terms of medical use, there is no excuse to any government not to allow it. For many reasons, I don't want to repeat myself, and I'm sure we will talk about it from many points of view. Yes, it's complicated with other use of cannabis and what kind of regulations, if we allow it. We'll allow free market as we know it with alcohol. Probably it's not a good idea. We find some very restrictive way of access. Maybe that's a better idea than prohibition. But let me finish with this thought of people who are called Global Commission. Global Commission are people who are usually ex-politicians or professionals or business people who, like, for example, an ex-president of Mexico who is a little bit familiar with the drugs policy and situations. 120,000 people died last 10 years, killed because of the drug war. Ex-president of Poland, ex-prime minister of Greece, Kofi Annan as ex-general secretary of UN, Javier Solana, ex-general secretary of NATO. People like that said, well, let's look at it. The silence about harms of repressive drug policies has been broken. They are ineffective. They violate basic human rights, generate violence, and expose individuals and communities to unnecessary risks. Now is the time to reform.